They had been trained to die for the Reich. Instead, they learned to question everything they'd been taught, one breakfast at a time. Picture this: May 1945. A convoy of dusty military trucks rolls through the plains of Oklahoma, carrying 37 German Red Cross nurses. They're exhausted, terrified, and convinced they're about to meet the fate the propaganda ministry promised them: torture, humiliation, perhaps worse. For 3 days they'd traveled across the Atlantic in the belly of a Liberty ship, then by train through landscapes so vast they seemed impossible. Everything about America felt wrong to them, wrong in its scale, wrong in its prosperity, wrong in ways that would shatter every certainty they'd carried from childhood. Sister Anna Bergmann pressed her face against the truck's canvas flap, watching telephone poles blur past. Beside her, Greta Hoffmann clutched a photograph of her family in Stuttgart, the last image before her brother's conscription, before the bombings, before the hunger that had carved her mother's face into something skeletal. "They'll separate us, work us until we collapse. That's what Nurse Hartman said would happen if we were captured." But when the trucks finally stopped at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, something strange happened. The air hit them first. Not the metallic tang of blood they'd known in field hospitals, not the acrid bite of smoke from burning cities, not even the sour smell of unwashed bodies packed too closely together. It was breakfast. The scent rolled across the compound in waves. Coffee, real coffee, not the grain substitute they'd choked down for years. Butter melting on something hot. And underneath it all, rich and impossible, frying bacon. Sister Bergmann's stomach clenched so hard she gasped. Around her, the other nurses stood frozen, bags in hand, trying to process what their noses told them, but their minds rejected. "Das ist unmöglich," someone breathed. "Impossible." One of the younger nurses, Liesel, barely 20, started to cry, not from fear anymore, but from the sudden, overwhelming memory of Sunday mornings before the war, of her grandmother's kitchen, of a world where meat wasn't just a memory, but a meal. The American guards watched this reaction with expressions the nurses couldn't quite read. Not cruelty, not mockery, something closer to, what? Understanding? Pity? A sergeant stepped forward, clipboard in hand. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of well-fed face that seemed obscene to women who'd spent 2 years watching soldiers and civilians alike waste away. "Welcome to Camp Gruber," he said in careful, practiced German. "You will be processed, assigned quarters, and fed. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Medical personnel are afforded certain protections. You are not criminals. You are prisoners of war." The words were formal, almost mechanical. But then he added, off script, "The mess hall opens in 30 minutes. I suggest you wash up first. The water is hot." Hot water. The nurses exchanged glances. This had to be a trick, some elaborate psychological torture. Show them comfort, then snatch it away. That's what war did. It took everything beautiful and turned it to ash. But Sister Bergmann thought of something her commanding officer had said back when the Americans first landed in Normandy. "They're soft, weak, they've never known hardship. When war truly comes to them, they'll crumble." Looking around at the sprawling camp, at the neat rows of barracks with actual roofs, at the guards in crisp uniforms that showed no signs of patching or threadbare wear, she wondered for the first time if her officer had been wrong. Very wrong. The processing took 2 hours. They were photographed, cataloged, their few possessions searched but not confiscated. Personal items, letters, photographs, small Bibles were returned with a courtesy that felt surreal. "Your quarters are here," an American nurse explained, leading them to a long wooden building. She spoke no German, but her gestures were clear. 2 to a bunk. Linens are changed weekly. Laundry pickup is Tuesday and Friday. The interior stopped them cold. Real mattresses. Thin, yes, but actual mattresses with springs, not straw pallets, not concrete floors with a single blanket. Each bunk had 2 wool blankets, folded military crisp. There were windows, Rio glass windows that opened to let in air. The floor was wooden, swept clean, and in the corner stood a potbelly stove for the winters. "This can't be for prisoners," Greta whispered. "This is better than what we had at the hospital in Berlin before the bombings." Sister Bergmann ran her hand over the blanket. The wool was coarse, but whole. No holes, no patches, just simple, functional abundance. "How many prisoners are here?" she asked the American nurse in broken English. The nurse understood. "This camp? About 3,000. Germans mostly, some Italians in the south section." 3,000 prisoners, all housed like this. The mathematics of it boggled the mind. Where did the materials come from? The Americans were fighting a war on 2 fronts, Europe and the Pacific. Their cities weren't burning, their factories weren't bombed to rubble, and yet they could afford to give enemy prisoners actual beds. 30 minutes, the nurse reminded them. "Mess hall is the large building to the east. You'll hear the bell." When she left, the nurses collapsed on bunks, bags still packed, trying to process what was happening. "It's propaganda," Martha Schneider announced. She was older, 45, with the kind of rigid certainty that came from years of following orders without question. "They'll feed us well for a few days, take photographs, send them to newspapers, make themselves look civilized. Then it will change." "Maybe," Sister Bergmann said quietly. But she was thinking about the nurse's casual mention of weekly laundry. Nobody staged propaganda with laundry schedules. The bell rang. The mess hall was chaos, organized into order. Hundreds of prisoners filing through lines, receiving trays, finding seats at long wooden tables. The noise was overwhelming after the silence of their journey. Metal clanging, men's voices in a dozen languages, American guards calling out instructions. But it was the food that silenced the German nurses mid-step. The serving line stretched along one wall, and behind it stood American soldiers, cooks in stained aprons, wielding ladles and serving spoons with the casual efficiency of men who did this 3 times a day, every day. The first nurse in their group, Liesel, held out her tray with shaking hands. A scoop of scrambled eggs, yellow and steaming. 2 pieces of toast, actual wheat bread with butter already melting into the surface. A portion of beans, a cup of coffee, dark and fragrant. And then, almost carelessly, the cook added 3 strips of bacon. Liesel stared at her tray, then at the cook, then back at her tray. For me?" she stammered in German. The cook didn't understand the words, but he understood the disbelief. He nodded, almost smiling. "Move along, please." One by one, the nurses received the same portions. Not less because they were women, not less because they were Germans, not less because they were prisoners. The same meal the American soldiers ate, from the same kitchen, served without ceremony or commentary. Sister Bergmann found a seat at a table, setting her tray down with the care one might give a sacred object. Around her, the other nurses did the same. For a long moment, nobody moved. They just looked. Greta's hands trembled over her fork. "In Stuttgart, my mother stands in line for 4 hours to buy 1 loaf of bread. 1 loaf, and it's half sawdust." My sister wrote that children are dying, not from bombs, from hunger. Just from hunger." The eggs cooled. The coffee sent up thin spirals of steam. "Eat," Sister Bergmann said finally. "Whatever this is, punishment or propaganda or some American madness, eat while we can." That first bite of eggs was almost painful. The richness of real butter, real salt, the simple perfection of protein after months of watery soup and black bread, it was too much. Several nurses couldn't finish. Their stomachs shrunk from deprivation, rebelled against abundance. But the bacon, God, the bacon! The smell alone triggered memories so powerful they hurt. Sunday dinners before the war, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, times when families gathered around tables that held more than desperation. Liesel bit into a strip and immediately started crying, great heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders. She wasn't alone. Half the nurses wept openly, some from joy, some from guilt, some from the sheer overwhelming wrongness of eating well while their families starved. An American guard noticed and approached, concerned. "Everything okay here?" Sister Bergmann wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes," she managed in English. "Yes, thank you." The guard looked uncomfortable, unsure how to handle weeping prisoners. Finally, he just nodded and moved on. Across the mess hall, American soldiers ate the same meal, talking about baseball, complaining about the heat, joking with each other. To them, this was ordinary, standard, nothing special. To the German nurses, it was a revelation so profound it felt like betrayal, not of their country, but of every lie they'd been told about what the war meant, about who was winning, about what kind of world existed beyond the Reich's borders. "How?" Greta asked, staring at her half-empty tray. "How do they have this? We were told America was weak, that their industry was failing, that their people were soft and their country was breaking." Marta, the skeptic, had no answer. She picked up a piece of toast and examined it as if it were evidence in a trial. "This bread is real wheat, not mixed with potato peels or chestnuts, just wheat. And the coffee," someone added. "It's not roasted acorns, it's coffee. And the bacon." "Don't talk about the bacon," Sister Bergmann said. "If we talk about the bacon, I'll start crying again." But the question hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If the enemy has this much, what does that say about our side's promises of victory?
That first day established a routine that would define their captivity. 3 meals a day, served at regular intervals. Not gourmet food, army food, plain and functional, but consistent, sufficient, and shockingly varied compared to what they'd known. Breakfast was usually eggs, toast, and some kind of meat. Sometimes bacon, sometimes sausage, occasionally ham. Coffee was unlimited. The nurses learned quickly that Americans drank coffee the way other people breathed air, constantly, casually, with a cultural importance they couldn't quite fathom. Lunch brought sandwiches, soups, or simple hot dishes, real cheese, lettuce, sometimes even fruit, apples or oranges, fresh, not canned. Dinner was the substantial meal: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and occasionally dessert. The desserts astonished them most. Who gave prisoners pie? Who had the sugar and butter and eggs to spare for such frivolity in the middle of a global war? After 3 days, Sister Bergmann stopped expecting the food to disappear. After a week, she stopped feeling guilty for every bite. After 2 weeks, she noticed her uniform was fitting differently, not loose from starvation, but filling out toward normal. The other nurses experienced the same transformation. Color returned to faces that had been gray with exhaustion. Eyes that had been hollow and haunted began to show something other than survival mode. Hair that had been brittle started to shine. They were becoming healthy in a prison camp, while their families starved in freedom. The contradiction was unbearable.
By the third week, the nurses began to understand that Camp Gruber wasn't just a holding facility. It was a machine, a vast, complex system designed not merely to contain prisoners, but to manage them, occupy them, and yes, even prepare them for an uncertain future. The camp covered over 40,000 acres. 40,000. Sister Bergmann learned this from a map posted in the administration building, and the number seemed impossible. That was larger than many German towns, and this was just one camp among hundreds scattered across America. How do they run something this big? Greta wondered aloud as they walked the perimeter during their designated exercise hour. The answer became clear through observation. Organization. Ruthless, efficient, almost boring organization. Everything happened on a schedule. Wake up was at 0600, roll call at 0630, breakfast at 0700, work assignments at 0800, lunch at 1200, more work until 1700, dinner at 1800, recreation time until 2100, lights out at 2200. Every day, 7 days a week, never varying unless it was Sunday, when the schedule relaxed slightly to allow for religious services, extended recreation, and what the Americans called downtime. But the schedule was only the surface. Beneath it ran layers of systems that kept 3,000 prisoners fed, clothed, medically treated, and occupied. The kitchen staff started work at 4 a.m. to prepare breakfast. The nurses could hear them sometimes when the morning was still dark and cool, the clang of pots, the rumble of industrial ovens, the shouts of men coordinating the assembly line of food preparation. One morning, Sister Bergmann was granted permission to observe the kitchen. She wanted to see where the meals came from, to understand the source of this impossible abundance. Which she found was more shocking than the food itself, an industrial marvel. The kitchen was enormous, equipped with massive stoves, oversized refrigeration units, and storage rooms that seemed to stretch forever. Whole sides of beef hung in cold rooms, sacks of flour and sugar were stacked higher than a man, crates of eggs, barrels of coffee, boxes of vegetables, all fresh, all abundant, all apparently inexhaustible. "How often do you receive shipments?" she asked the head cook, an older sergeant with a Brooklyn accent she could barely understand. "Twice a week," he said, stirring a pot of oatmeal large enough to bathe in. "More if we need it. The supply lines run regular as clockwork." "And you never run short?" "Lady, we got more food than we know what to do with sometimes. The government makes sure of that. Can't have prisoners claiming we starved them. Bad for the reputation." Reputation. There was that word again. Sister Bergmann was beginning to understand that much of what seemed like kindness was actually strategy. America didn't treat prisoners well out of pure moral virtue, though perhaps that played a role. They did it because the world was watching, because they needed to prove they were better than the Nazis, better than the Japanese, better than anyone who might claim the moral high ground. But did the motivation matter if the result was hot meals and medical care? She wasn't sure.
The medical clinic was another revelation. The German nurses were assigned to work there under supervision. Their skills were needed, and the Geneva Convention mandated that medical personnel could be put to work in their field. Sister Bergmann had expected something rudimentary, field medicine at best. What she found instead was a fully equipped hospital that would have been impressive even in peacetime Berlin. The examination rooms had proper beds with white sheets. The surgical suite, yes, they had a surgical suite, gleamed with stainless steel instruments, autoclave sterilizers, and bright overhead lights. There was an X-ray machine, an actual X-ray machine in a prison camp for prisoners. And the pharmacy. Sister Bergmann stood in the pharmacy on her first day and simply stared. Wall-to-wall shelves holding bottles and bottles of medicine. Aspirin, sulfa drugs, morphine for pain management, quinine for malaria, insulin for diabetics, and in the refrigerated cabinet, locked but visible, penicillin. Rows and rows of penicillin. She knew what penicillin meant. In Germany, it was legend, the miracle drug that could cure infections that had killed soldiers by the thousands in previous wars. The Reich had tried to produce it but failed. The Americans and British had succeeded, and they guarded their production methods like military secrets, which meant that each vial represented not just medicine, but industrial capability, scientific advancement, an economy so robust it could afford to give cutting-edge antibiotics to enemy prisoners. "We use it freely," the American doctor, Captain Morrison, explained when he saw her staring. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never stopped moving. "No point letting a man die from an infection we can cure. Doesn't matter if he's American, German, Italian, or Japanese. An infection's an infection." "But the cost," Sister Bergmann began. "The factories make it faster than we can use it. Penicillin, sulfa, plasma, morphine. We got supply chains that make your head spin. Plants in the Midwest running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Nobody goes without. Not our boys, not the civilians, and not the POWs." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if the idea of infinite medical supplies was normal, expected, the natural state of things. Sister Bergmann thought of the hospital in Berlin where she'd trained, the hospital that had been reduced to rubble in the 1943 bombings, the replacement facility where they'd washed bandages to reuse them, where they'd rationed morphine so carefully that men screamed through amputations, where infections killed more men than bullets because there was nothing to fight them with. "In Germany," she said slowly, "we had 1 vial of penicillin for every 100 wounded soldiers, and we had to choose who received it." Captain Morrison stopped cleaning his glasses. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "Jesus," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." And the worst part was that he meant it.
As the weeks turned into months, the nurses began to recognize faces, learn names, understand the social ecosystem of Camp Gruber. There was Corporal Davies, the guard who walked the eastern perimeter every morning, whistling the same 3 songs on rotation. He had a daughter in California who sent him drawings, which he showed to anyone who'd look. There was Lieutenant Castellano, whose family ran a restaurant in New York, and who complained constantly about the quality of the camp's pasta. "My nana would die if she saw this. Die! This is not how you cook macaroni." There was Private Washington, a quiet man from Georgia who worked in the supply depot, and who once, when no one was looking, slipped Liesel an extra blanket when she complained of being cold at night. These men weren't monsters. They weren't even particularly remarkable. They were just people. Young men far from home, doing a job, counting the days until the war ended and they could return to normal life. But it was the American nurses who truly complicated the German women's understanding of their captors. There were 3 nurses assigned to supervise the German medical personnel: Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a farm girl from Iowa with practical hands and a sharp tongue; Lieutenant Catherine Brennan, a city girl from Boston who'd graduated from nursing school the same year the war started; and Lieutenant Dorothy Hayes, a black woman from Alabama whose very presence challenged everything the German nurses had been taught. Lieutenant Hayes was the one who fascinated and confused them most. In Nazi Germany, they'd been fed constant propaganda about race, about hierarchies, about who was capable of what. The entire foundation of the Reich rested on these supposed truths. Yet here was Lieutenant Hayes, educated, competent, authoritative, and treated by her white colleagues with the same professional respect they showed each other, at least within the camp.
Sister Bergmann worked alongside her frequently. Hayes was an excellent nurse, efficient, knowledgeable, and patient with the German women who still spoke limited English. One day, while changing bandages on a prisoner with an infected leg wound, Sister Bergmann worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "Lieutenant Hayes," she began, stumbling over the English, "in Germany we were told about America, about people like you, that you were—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the lies without giving them new life. Hayes didn't look up from the bandage she was wrapping. "Inferior? Stupid? Violent? Less than human?" she supplied calmly. Sister Bergmann flushed. "Yes." "And what do you think now?" Hayes asked, still not looking up. "I think," Sister Bergmann said slowly, "that everything we were told was a lie." Hayes finished securing the bandage, then finally met her eyes. "Not everything about America is what it seems, sister. Inside these gates, we're all soldiers doing a job. Outside?" She shook her head. "Outside is more complicated. I can't vote in Alabama. I can't eat in most restaurants in my hometown. My uniform means something here. Back home, all some folks see is my skin. But you are a lieutenant, an officer, educated, skilled. And in America that sometimes matters, sometimes it doesn't. We're fighting a war against everything your country stands for: racism, supremacy, totalitarianism. But we haven't finished fighting those battles at home yet." She looked directly at Sister Bergmann. "America isn't perfect, but at least here, those battles are possible. In Nazi Germany, there was no debate, no possibility of change, just certainty. And certainty is how you end up gassing people." The bluntness shocked Sister Bergmann, but it also clarified something. America wasn't presenting itself as flawless. These Americans, at least some of them, understood their country's contradictions and were willing to name them. That, perhaps, was more powerful than propaganda.
The German male prisoners in the camp presented another complexity. There were infantry soldiers, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over France, submarine crews pulled from the Atlantic, even a few officers who kept to themselves and maintained rigid military bearing despite captivity. The nurses weren't supposed to fraternize, but conversations happened anyway. In the medical clinic, during recreation hours, while standing in line for meals. Private Klaus Richter, a 22-year-old conscript from Bavaria, summed up what many felt. Everything they told us was backwards. America was supposed to be weak, divided, incapable of matching German industry. Instead, they make more of everything than we ever did. They have food while our families starve. They have medicine while our hospitals close. And they don't even seem to try that hard. It's just normal for them. "Maybe that's the point," Sister Bergmann replied. "In Germany, we mobilized everything. Every factory, every farm, every person was bent toward the war effort. America did the same thing, but they're so big, with so many resources, that they could wage total war and still have enough left over to feed us bacon for breakfast." "It makes you wonder," Klaus said quietly, "what we were fighting for. If the Führer knew how powerful they were, why did he declare war?" It was a dangerous question. Even in captivity, even surrounded by American guards, old habits of caution remained. You didn't question the leadership. You didn't voice doubts. But more and more, in whispered conversations, in private moments, the prisoners asked it anyway. By the third month, life in the camp had achieved a strange normalcy. The initial shock had faded, replaced by routine. The nurses woke, worked, ate, wrote letters, and slept. Day after day, week after week. But the routines revealed deeper truths about American society and the war effort. Take Laundry Day. Every Tuesday and Friday, massive trucks arrived carrying industrial washing equipment. The prisoners' uniforms, linens, and personal clothing were collected, washed with real soap and hot water, and returned clean and folded. Real soap, not the chemical substitute that barely created lather and left skin raw. Actual soap that smelled like soap. Greta became obsessed with this detail. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked one evening, holding up her freshly laundered uniform. "Somewhere in America, there's a factory making soap. Enough soap that they can spare it for prisoners. They're not rationing it, not hoarding it, just making it, constantly." "It's the same with everything," Marta added. She'd given up her initial suspicions of propaganda and had started keeping notes instead, documenting everything she observed. Coffee, sugar, gasoline for the trucks, electricity for the lights, lumber for repairs. It never stops. They never run out. The education opportunities were another surprise. The camp ran classes, English lessons, American history, vocational training. Attendance was voluntary, but many prisoners attended, partly from boredom, partly from genuine curiosity. Sister Bergmann attended the English classes taught by a retired school teacher from Tulsa named Mrs. Henderson. She was a grandmother type, patient and encouraging, who seemed completely unbothered by the fact that her students were enemy prisoners. "Why do you do this?" Sister Bergmann asked her one evening. "Why teach us?" Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Because when you go home, you'll need to rebuild. And if you speak English, if you understand how we think, maybe we can have peace instead of another war in 20 years. Besides," she added, "I like teaching. Doesn't matter who I'm teaching, long as they want to learn." It was such a simple, practical answer. No grand ideology, no political posturing, just an old woman who liked teaching, doing what she was good at. The recreation time revealed even more. Prisoners could play sports, soccer mostly, though some Americans tried to teach them baseball with limited success. There was a library stocked with German and English books. On Sunday evenings, the camp showed movies, projected onto a white sheet hung against the mess hall wall. The first time Sister Bergmann saw an American film, a musical, something light and frivolous with singing and dancing, she was baffled. This is what Americans watch during a war? Not propaganda films about sacrifice and victory, but entertainment? "They don't take the war seriously," Klaus muttered beside her. "Look at them, they're laughing." But Sister Bergmann wasn't sure that was true. Maybe the Americans took the war so seriously that they understood the need for moments of normalcy, for laughter, for reminders that life existed beyond conflict. Or maybe, and this thought was most disturbing, maybe they were so confident of victory that they could afford frivolity.
The letters from home continued to arrive, each one a knife of guilt and confusion. Greta's mother wrote that Stuttgart was unrecognizable, entire neighborhoods gone, the cathedral damaged. Her father had died during a bombing raid, suffocated in a shelter when the entrance collapsed. Another nurse learned her fiancé had been killed on the Eastern Front. The letter from his mother was brief, almost clinical in its grief. There was no body to bury, just a notification. Liesel received word that her younger siblings had been evacuated to the countryside, to a farm where at least there was food. Her mother remained in Berlin, working in a factory, making something. The censors had blacked out that detail. These letters arrived in the same camp where the nurses had gained weight, where their hair had grown glossy from adequate nutrition, where they worked in a heated building with hot running water. The disconnect was obscene. Some nights the nurses gathered to read letters aloud, sharing the news, supporting each other through grief. They cried together, raged together, and then, come morning, filed into the mess hall for eggs and bacon. "I feel like a traitor,"
Liesel confessed one night. "My family is starving, and I'm healthy, I'm comfortable. I'm better off as a prisoner than they are as free Germans." "You're not a traitor," Sister Bergmann said firmly. "You didn't choose this. None of us did. But we benefit from it. Yes, we do. And that's not our fault. It's the fault of the men who started this war. Hitler, Goebbels, Goering, all of them. They promised us victory and delivered ruin. The Americans didn't make our family starve. Our own leaders did." It was the closest she'd come to open criticism of the regime. Even here, even in American captivity, decades of conditioning made such words feel dangerous. But they were also true. And truth, Sister Bergmann was learning, was more powerful than propaganda.
In November 1945, a group of prisoners, including several nurses, were taken on an educational trip. The Americans called it a democracy orientation program, though the real purpose was simpler: show the prisoners what they'd been fighting against. They were loaded into buses and driven south through Oklahoma and into Texas. The landscape rolled past in endless variations of plains and sky, occasionally broken by towns that seemed almost offensively intact. No bomb damage, no rubble, just normal American towns with shops and schools and people living normal lives.
"It's like the war doesn't exist here," Marta whispered.
Their destination was a manufacturing plant outside Dallas, one of many across America producing war materials. The prisoners expected a grim, militaristic facility. What they found instead was staggering. The plant covered acres. Multiple buildings housing assembly lines, warehouses, administrative offices, even a cafeteria for the workers. Smokestacks rose against the sky, pumping out steady streams of exhaust that spoke of constant production. They were given a tour by a manager named Mr. Hoffman, whose German surname and fluent command of the language suggested immigrant roots. "We run 3 shifts, 24 hours a day," Hoffman explained, as they walked through the main assembly floor. "This facility alone produces enough aircraft components to supply 12 fighter planes per week. There are 50 facilities like this across the country, each making different parts." The noise was incredible. Machinery clanging, rivets being driven, metal being shaped and cut and welded. But what stunned the German nurses most was the workforce. Women. Hundreds of women in coveralls and headscarves operating heavy machinery, welding, assembling complex components with practiced efficiency. "Where are the men?" Greta asked. "Fighting, or already back from fighting. But we found that women can do this work just as well, better sometimes. They're more careful with the details." Sister Bergmann watched a young woman, no older than 20, expertly operate a drill press, creating perfect holes in a sheet of aluminum. Beside her, another woman checked measurements with calipers, making notes on a clipboard. These women were doing jobs that in Germany would have been considered far too technical, too important, too difficult for female workers. In the Reich, women were told our place was in the home, to raise children, to support our husbands. Sister Bergmann said carefully. Hoffman nodded. "I've read that. Here we discovered we needed everyone, every able body. So we trained them, and they showed up. Rosie the Riveter, we call them. Women who kept America's arsenal running while the men fought." The tour continued through the sprawling facility. They saw raw materials arriving by train: steel, aluminum, rubber, copper. They saw those materials transformed through dozens of steps into finished components. They saw quality control stations where every piece was inspected. They saw the shipping department where completed items were packed and sent to assembly plants, airfields, or directly to the front lines. And everywhere, the sense of abundance. Stacks of materials, crates of finished goods,
No signs of shortage or desperation, just relentless, efficient production. At the end of the tour, Hoffman led them to the cafeteria. Even there, the contrast was brutal. The workers' lunch included a hot meal, vegetables, bread, and dessert. There was a coffee station with unlimited refills. "They eat like this every day?" Liesel asked, watching workers laugh and chat over their meals. "Every day," Hoffman confirmed. "Good nutrition means better work. Better work means more production. More production means we win the war. It's not charity, it's strategy." On the bus ride back to camp, the nurses were silent. Each woman processed what she had seen in her own way, but the implications were impossible to ignore. Germany had mobilized its entire society for war. Women had been conscripted into factories, yes, but those factories had increasingly produced less and less as raw materials disappeared, as bombing raids destroyed infrastructure, as the tide of war turned against them. America had also mobilized completely. But their factories didn't just survive, they thrived, they expanded, they hired more workers, ran more shifts, produced more goods than the Axis powers combined. The war, Sister Bergmann realized, had been decided not on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over Britain, but in places like this, massive industrial plants churning out materials with a consistency and scale that Germany could never match. "We never had a chance," Klaus said quietly that evening in the camp. He'd been on a similar tour to a steel mill. "Did we, against this kind of production?" Sister Bergmann thought of the penicillin in the camp pharmacy, the bacon at breakfast, the soap for laundry, the gasoline for trucks that never ran dry. All of it came from somewhere, from plants like the one they had visited, from an industrial system so vast and efficient that even total war couldn't exhaust it. "No, we never did," she said finally.
December brought cold weather to Oklahoma, though nothing like the brutal winters Sister Bergmann had endured in Berlin. The camp provided extra blankets, and the potbelly stoves in the barracks were stoked through the night. Christmas approached, and with it a melancholy that settled over the prisoners like fog. They were allowed to write special holiday letters home, slightly longer than usual, with fewer censor marks. Sister Bergmann sat at a table in the barracks, pen poised over paper, trying to find words that would comfort her mother without revealing the shameful truth that she was spending Christmas better fed and housed than anyone in Germany. "Dear Mutter," she wrote, then stopped. What could she say? That the Americans had set up a Christmas tree in the mess hall, decorated with paper ornaments made in craft classes? That there would be a special holiday meal? Turkey, the Americans promised, whatever that was? That prisoners had been allowed to rehearse Christmas carols and would perform them on Christmas Eve? None of it would make sense to her mother, who by now might be burning furniture for heat. In the end, she wrote simply, "I am well. I am safe. I think of you constantly. The war will end soon, and then I will come home. Please hold on until then. Your daughter, Anna." It felt inadequate. But what else was there? Around her, other nurses struggled with similar letters. Some cried quietly as they wrote. Others stared at blank pages, unable to begin. "What do you write?" Greta asked bitterly, "to people who are suffering when you are not?"
Christmas Day, 1945, was surreal. The mess hall had been decorated with pine branches and paper chains. The American soldiers were cheerful, many sharing photographs of their own families, talking about Christmases past and future. The meal was extraordinary. Turkey, a bird the German nurses had never tasted, with stuffing, gravy, potatoes, cranberry sauce, rolls with butter, green beans, and for dessert, something called pumpkin pie.
The portions were generous. The food was hot and plentiful. And sitting there, eating this feast, Sister Bergmann felt a wave of guilt so powerful she nearly left the table. "My mother has nothing," she said aloud, to no one in particular. "My mother has nothing, and I have this." Beside her, Lieutenant Hayes, who was working the holiday shift, paused. "Your mother would want you to eat," she said gently. "A mother always wants her child fed. That doesn't change because of war or politics or borders." "But it's wrong. This is wrong." "Yes," Hayes agreed. "War is wrong. What's happening to your family is wrong. But you starving yourself in sympathy doesn't make them less hungry. It just means more people suffering." It was logical, practical, but it didn't ease the ache in Sister Bergmann's chest. After the meal, the prisoners gathered for the carol service, Germans and Americans alike, standing together in the cold night air under a sky full of stars, singing Silent Night in both languages simultaneously. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night." The harmony was imperfect, the pronunciation mangled, but there was something profound in that moment. Enemies singing together of peace, of hope, of a world beyond war. When it ended, several prisoners and guards alike wiped away tears.
January 1946 brought news that the war in Europe was truly over, not just militarily, but administratively. The paperwork was processed, treaties were signed. The Third Reich, such as it was, officially ceased to exist. For the prisoners, this raised an impossible question. What now? "We can't go home yet," Lieutenant Mitchell explained during one of their work shifts in the infirmary. "Germany is, well, it's complicated. There's no government to release you to. The Allies have divided the country into zones. Food is scarce. Housing is scarcer. Frankly, you're better off here for now." Better off as prisoners. The statement would have been laughable 6 months ago. Now it was simply true. But remaining in the camp meant continuing to participate in this strange, halfway existence, not free, but not suffering either. Fed, clothed, safe, and increasingly comfortable with American ways. The nurses began to notice changes in themselves, small things at first. Greta found herself thinking in English occasionally after months of language classes and daily exposure. Liesel caught herself humming an American song she'd heard in one of the Sunday movies. Sister Bergmann realized one morning that she'd stopped flinching every time she heard an airplane overhead. In Germany, planes meant bombers, meant death. Here, they were just part of the background noise. They were adapting, assimilating even, and that terrified some of them. "We're forgetting," Marta said one evening, "forgetting what was done to our country, what we lost, who we were." "Maybe," Sister Bergmann replied, "but we're also remembering what it's like to be human, to have full stomachs and clean clothes and work that matters. Is that so wrong? It is if it makes us forget our duty." "Duty to what? The Reich is gone. Hitler is dead. Germany is occupied. What duty do we have except to survive and rebuild when we can?" It was a conversation they'd had in various forms a dozen times. The tension between loyalty to a homeland that no longer existed and the pragmatic reality of their situation. But underneath it ran a deeper question. Who were they now? German nurses who'd experienced American abundance? Prisoners who'd been treated better than civilians? Women who'd seen their worldview shattered and were trying to assemble a new one from the pieces? In February, something remarkable happened. The camp administration announced that prisoners with medical training could volunteer for a new program, providing health care to nearby civilian communities that lacked doctors. Under guard, German nurses would travel to small towns, set up temporary clinics, and treat American civilians, mostly poor families, migrant workers, and elderly people in rural areas who had no access to regular medical care. The irony was staggering. Enemy prisoners providing health care to the people of the country they'd been fighting. Sister Bergmann volunteered immediately. The first clinic was held in a tiny town called Broken Bow, Oklahoma, a place so small it barely appeared on maps. The clinic was set up in a church basement, with donated supplies and equipment hauled in by truck. The people who came were poor, painfully poor. Many hadn't seen a doctor in years. Some had never seen one at all. An elderly farmer with a wound that had festered for weeks. A pregnant woman with no prenatal care. A child with a fever that had lasted days. They came in a steady stream, grateful and nervous, some clearly uncomfortable being treated by German prisoners, but desperate enough to accept help anyway. Sister Bergmann worked alongside Lieutenant Hayes, and together they saw patient after patient. The medical work was familiar, comforting even. This is what she'd trained for, what she was good at. But what struck her most was the gratitude. These Americans, poor as they were, thanked her, actually thanked her. Some brought small offerings, a jar of preserves, a dozen eggs, a hand-knitted scarf as payment. "You don't have to," Sister Bergmann protested when an old woman pressed a bag of pecans into her hands. "I pay my debts," the woman said firmly. On the drive back to camp, Sister Bergmann was quiet, processing what she'd experienced. "What are you thinking?" Lieutenant Hayes asked. "I'm thinking," Sister Bergmann said slowly, "that America is not one thing. The factories and the abundance, yes, but also places like Broken Bow. People who have so little but still give, who accept help from their enemies because they need it, and who see us as nurses first and Germans second." "That's true everywhere," Hayes replied. "Every country has rich and poor, generous and cruel. The question is what the country aspires to be, what it's trying to become." "And what is America trying to become?" Hayes smiled. "Complicated question. Ask me again after we sort out our own problems with segregation and inequality. But I'll say this. At least here, the question can be asked. The debate can happen. That's something." It was more than something, Sister Bergmann thought. It was everything.
By spring of 1946, repatriation efforts were beginning in earnest. Prisoners would be returned to Germany in waves, starting with those who had homes and families to return to. The nurses received notification in April. They would be among the first groups, scheduled to leave in May. The news brought mixed emotions: relief to see families again, dread of what they'd find, and unexpectedly, guilt at leaving. "I'll miss the food," Liesel joked weakly. "I'll miss hot water," Greta added. Sister Bergmann knew they'd miss more than creature comforts. They'd miss feeling safe. They'd miss the routine. They'd miss believing that tomorrow would be basically like today, stable, predictable, sufficient. In Germany, nothing was certain anymore. The final weeks were spent preparing. The nurses were given new clothes to replace their worn uniforms. Simple dresses, practical shoes, warm coats. They were provided travel documents, a small amount of money, and instructions for reporting to occupation authorities once they arrived. They were also given something unexpected: letters of reference. Captain Morrison wrote one for Sister Bergmann, describing her work in the infirmary, her skill, her dedication. "This woman is an excellent nurse who served with competence and compassion. She will be an asset to any medical facility or community fortunate enough to employ her." Sister Bergmann read it 3 times, tears blurring the words. A letter of reference from an American officer to help her find work in occupied Germany. The kindness of it, the practical, forward-thinking kindness, overwhelmed her.
The final breakfast was on May 15, 1946. The nurses ate slowly, savoring what they knew would be their last American meal for a long time, perhaps forever. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. The same breakfast they'd eaten hundreds of times, but this time they tasted every bite, memorized every flavor. "Will we tell people?" Liesel asked quietly. "About this? About how we were treated?" "We have to," Sister Bergmann replied. "If we don't, if we pretend it was different than it was, we're just creating new propaganda. Germany needs truth now. Hard truths, uncomfortable truths, but truth nonetheless." They won't believe us. Some won't, but some will, and those people will help rebuild something better than what came before. The bus that took them from Camp Gruber to the train station was the same type that had brought them in. But the women riding it were different. Healthier, yes, physically transformed by a year of adequate nutrition and rest, but changed in deeper ways, too. They had seen abundance and efficiency. They had experienced fairness from an enemy. They had worked alongside people they'd been taught to hate and found common humanity instead. They carried these experiences like seeds, uncertain what might grow from them, but convinced of their importance.
The journey back to Germany took 3 weeks, by train to New York, by ship across the Atlantic, by truck through the occupation zones to processing centers. With each mile closer to home, the contrast grew sharper. New York City, glimpsed briefly from the ship, was a blaze of lights and activity. Buildings reaching toward the sky, cars filling streets, people moving with purpose and prosperity. The German ports they arrived at were skeletal. Cranes stood broken. Buildings were hollowed shells. The smell of destruction, burned wood, stagnant water, death that hadn't been fully cleaned up, hung over everything. Sister Bergmann stood on deck as they approached Hamburg and wept, not from joy at returning home, but from grief at what home had become. The processing center was chaos. Thousands of returning POWs, displaced persons, refugees, all trying to get somewhere, find someone, piece together fractured lives. Sister Bergmann found her mother after 2 days of searching. She barely recognized her. The woman who greeted her was skeletal, aged a decade in the 2 years since they'd last seen each other. Her clothes were patched and repatched. Her shoes were held together with twine. They embraced, and Sister Bergmann felt bones through the worn fabric of her mother's coat. "You look well," her mother said wonderingly. "So healthy. Were you treated well?" And there it was, the question she'd known was coming. Sister Bergmann chose honesty. "Yes, Mutter, better than I deserved. Better than I expected, better than this." Her mother nodded slowly. "The Americans? Yes. Tell me." So Sister Bergmann told her about the bacon and coffee, about the medicine and the clean beds, about Lieutenant Hayes and Captain Morrison and Mrs. Henderson, about the factory in Dallas and the clinic in Broken Bow, about Christmas dinner and Sunday movies, and the strange, disorienting experience of being a prisoner who felt safer than a free citizen. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Sister Bergmann finished, they sat in silence for a long moment. "We were lied to," her mother said finally, "about everything, about who was winning, about what we were fighting for, about what the enemy was like, all lies. Yes. And now we must live with the consequences. Yes." But her mother surprised her by taking her hand and squeezing it. "But you survived. You're here. And you've seen something important. You've seen what's possible when a country builds instead of destroys. Remember that, Anna.
When we rebuild, remember that. The months that followed were the hardest of Sister Bergmann's life. She found work at a makeshift hospital in Hamburg's ruins, a partially repaired building with minimal supplies and overwhelming need. Patients came with injuries, infections, malnutrition, and trauma. There was never enough of anything: bandages, medicine, food, heat, hope. She thought often of the pharmacy at Camp Gruber, with its rows of penicillin. Here, they rationed aspirin. But she worked with what she had. And when she trained younger nurses who'd survived the war, she taught them more than medical techniques. She taught them about systems, about organization, about the importance of cleanliness and record-keeping, lessons learned from American efficiency. "Why do we spend time on paperwork when people are dying?" one young nurse complained. "Because in the long run, systems save more lives than individual heroics. I learned that from the Americans. They don't just treat patients, they build systems that prevent diseases from spreading, that track supplies, that create sustainable health care. We need to do the same." Gradually, painfully, life began to stabilize. The Marshall Plan brought aid, food, medicine, materials for rebuilding. American officials administered parts of the occupation zone with the same methodical efficiency Sister Bergmann had seen at Camp Gruber. She was grateful for it, even as it reminded her constantly of what she'd witnessed as a prisoner. Other nurses from the camp had similar experiences. Greta found work teaching English, suddenly a valuable skill in occupied Germany. Liesel joined the reconstruction effort, helping to coordinate housing for displaced persons. Marta worked with a Protestant church organization distributing aid. They stayed in touch through letters, sharing their experiences, supporting each other through the difficult adjustment. In one letter, Greta wrote, "Do you remember when we thought the bacon was propaganda? How naive we were. It wasn't propaganda. It was just normal life for them. That's the real lesson. They won because that was their normal." Sister Bergmann kept that letter, along with Captain Morrison's reference and dozens of other mementos from her captivity. She kept them in a small wooden box that she would, decades later, show to her grandchildren.
By 1950, West Germany was beginning to resemble a functional country again. The economy was recovering, cities were being rebuilt, and a new government was taking shape, this time democratic. Sister Bergmann, now working at a rebuilt hospital in Hamburg, sometimes led training sessions for young German doctors and nurses. And inevitably, when discussions turned to medical systems and hospital administration, she found herself saying, "When I was in America..." The stories came out in pieces, never bragging, never complaining about her time in Germany, just observations about what worked, how supplies were managed, how staff was trained, how patients were tracked. The mechanics of abundance translated into a system that could function even with scarcity. Some of the younger Germans who'd been children during the war asked her directly, what were the Americans really like? Sister Bergmann always paused before answering, because the truth was complicated. They were people, she'd say, capable of kindness and cruelty like anyone. But they had something we didn't. They had systems that valued efficiency and abundance over ideology. They believed deep down that there was enough. Enough food, enough medicine, enough resources for everyone, including their enemies. And that belief shaped everything they did. "So we should become like Americans?" a young nurse asked once. "No," Sister Bergmann replied. "We should become the best version of ourselves, but we should learn from what works, regardless of where it comes from. That's not betrayal. That's wisdom."
In 1955, West Germany officially regained sovereignty. The occupation ended.
American troops remained as allies rather than occupiers. Sister Bergmann attended a ceremony in Hamburg marking the occasion. There were speeches about friendship, cooperation, and shared values. The irony of it, former enemies now allies, was not lost on anyone. Standing in the crowd, Sister Bergmann thought back to that first morning at Camp Gruber. The smell of bacon, the terror and confusion, the slow, disorienting realization that everything she'd been taught was wrong. A decade had passed since then. A decade of rebuilding, of learning, of growing. Germany would never return to what it had been before the war, and that was good. What came before had led to catastrophe. What came after had a chance to be better. She thought of Lieutenant Hayes and wondered where she was now. Back in Alabama, perhaps, fighting her own battles for equality in a country that was still working out its contradictions. She thought of Captain Morrison, Mrs. Henderson, the sergeant who denounced "Welcome to Camp Gruber" in careful German. She thought of the prisoner she'd worked alongside, scattered now across a rebuilding Germany, carrying their own complicated memories. And she thought about the lesson at the heart of it all, that humanity persists even in war, that enemies are still people, and that the measure of a civilization is not just its weapons or victories, but its capacity for mercy, for organization, for building systems that lift everyone up.
Sister Bergmann retired from nursing in 1970, after 40 years in the profession. She'd seen Germany transform from ruins to one of Europe's most prosperous nations, the economic miracle that seemed to prove that destruction could be overcome with determination, smart systems, and yes, significant American aid. In her retirement, she was interviewed occasionally by historians studying the POW experience. She told her story honestly, never hiding the contrasts that had defined her captivity. "Were you grateful to your captors?" one historian asked. "I was grateful for their humanity," she replied. "And I was grateful that they showed me a different way of thinking about resources, about organization, about what a society could achieve when it focused on building rather than destroying. But grateful for being captured? No. The whole war was a waste. Millions died. Cities were destroyed. Families were shattered. If Germany had had better leaders, if we had built instead of conquered, none of it would have been necessary." Do you think your experience was typical? I think it was typical of American POW camps, yes. Not all prisoners were treated well everywhere. There were exceptions, problems, injustices. But the system, the overall approach, was to follow the Geneva Conventions and treat prisoners humanely. That was policy, and mostly it was practiced. Why do you think that was? Sister Bergmann smiled. Partly because Americans believed in rules and fairness, at least as an ideal. Partly because they knew the world was watching. Partly because they could afford it. Their abundance made mercy practical. And partly because they understood that how you treat enemies during the war shapes what comes after. They wanted us to go home with stories of American fairness, and we did.
In 1985, at age 72, Sister Bergmann did something she'd thought about for decades. She traveled back to America. She visited Oklahoma, though Camp Gruber had long since been decommissioned. She stood where the mess hall had been, where the infirmary had stood, where she'd spent a year of her life that had changed everything. The land was empty now, returned to farms and prairie. But she could still picture it. The barracks, the barbed wire, the guards, the routines that had structured her days. And she could still smell, in memory, the bacon that had greeted her that first morning. A local historian had arranged her visit and interviewed her for the town's archives.
They walked the grounds together as she pointed out where things had been. "What's the most important thing people should understand about this place?" the historian asked. Sister Bergmann thought for a long moment. That enemies are not monsters. That war doesn't erase humanity, though it tries. That systems matter. How a society organizes itself, what it values, what it makes abundant and what it makes scarce. And that mercy, even strategic mercy, has power. The Americans could have treated us terribly. International law and public opinion might not have stopped them, but they chose differently. And that choice shaped the peace that followed. She paused, looking out over the empty fields. "I came here as a prisoner, convinced I was entering hell. I left understanding that even America, with all its flaws and contradictions, had built something remarkable. Not just military might, but industrial capacity, organizational systems, and yes, a kind of practical idealism that said even enemies deserved basic dignity. That's the America I met here. That's what I carried home, and that's what helped us rebuild into something better than what we'd been."
Sister Anna Bergmann died in 1994 at age 81. Her grandchildren found, among her possessions, that small wooden box of mementos. Inside were letters from fellow nurses, a faded photograph of Camp Gruber, Captain Morrison's letter of reference, and a small notebook where she'd recorded her experiences. One entry, dated May 15, 1946, her last day at the camp, read simply, "Final breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. I ate slowly, trying to remember every detail. Not because the food itself mattered, but because of what it represented. A world where there was enough, where systems worked, where enemies could be treated as humans. I return to a Germany that has nothing, but I carry with me the memory of a country that had everything and chose to share even with its enemies. That memory will guide me in whatever comes next." We were told America was weak, decadent, divided. Instead, I found a country so strong it could afford mercy, so organized it made abundance seem ordinary, so confident in its values it could live them even toward those who had fought against them. Germany will rebuild. We must rebuild. And when we do, I hope we remember this lesson, that true strength is not in conquering, but in creating. Not in taking, but in making so much that there's enough for everyone, including your enemies. Today I leave captivity. Tomorrow I return to freedom. But I will never forget the year I spent discovering that the world I'd been taught to believe in was a lie, and that truth, even uncomfortable truth, is the only foundation worth building on. Her granddaughter, reading this entry decades later, asked her mother, "Was America really like this, or is this just how she remembered it?" Her mother, Sister Bergmann's daughter, born after the war, considered the question. She was honest about everything else in her life. Why would she lie about this? Besides, I think the real question is not whether America was perfect. It wasn't, and she knew that. The question is what we learn from the contrast she experienced between a system that could feed its prisoners bacon and a system that couldn't feed its own children bread. What did she learn? That abundance isn't about having resources. It's about how you organize them. That systems matter more than ideology. That treating people with dignity, even your enemies, is not weakness, but the foundation of lasting peace. And that the smell of breakfast cooking can be revolutionary if you've been taught to expect cruelty instead. She closed the notebook gently. Grandma Anna believed that Germany learned these lessons. That's why we rebuilt into a democracy, a strong economy, a peaceful nation. Not because we copied America, but because we were forced to question everything we'd believed. And some of us, like her, found answers in the strangest places. Like a prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma, where the smell of bacon reminded captured nurses that the world could be different than the lies they'd been told.
The German nurses who stepped off buses in Texas and Oklahoma in 1945 expected punishment. Instead, they discovered abundance. They expected cruelty. Instead, they found systems. They expected propaganda. Instead, they lived truth. Their story isn't just about World War II or prison camps or even German-American relations. It's about what happens when ideology meets reality, when propaganda confronts lived experience, and when enemies are forced to recognize each other's humanity. It's about the power of systems, how America's industrial might, organizational efficiency, and logistical genius won the war not through superior courage or tactics, but through superior abundance. It's about mercy as strategy, and how treating prisoners well served America's interests while also serving higher values. Most of all, it's about a simple breakfast that became a symbol. Bacon and eggs that represented everything the Reich had promised and failed to deliver, everything America had built while Germany had destroyed. Sister Anna Bergmann spent the rest of her life telling this story, teaching these lessons, insisting that Germany's future lay in learning from the past, all of it, even the uncomfortable parts, especially the uncomfortable parts. She believed that truth, no matter how challenging, was the only foundation for lasting peace. She believed that systems mattered more than slogans. She believed that abundance was possible, but only if you built for it, rather than conquered for it. And she believed that the smell of bacon on a spring morning in 1945 had taught her more about the nature of power, civilization, and humanity than all the propaganda of the Third Reich combined. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, these small moments of humanity in the midst of war, these lessons about systems and mercy and the power of abundance, then subscribe. Because history isn't just about battles and treaties. It's about bacon and coffee and clean sheets and medicine on shelves. It's about the small details that reveal the bigger truths. It's about German nurses who went home carrying the memory of American breakfast and who used that memory to help build a better Germany. That's a story worth keeping alive.